Hello fellow classmates and Dr. Kickler. My name is Harvey Fulmer and I'm presenting this multimedia presentation. I'm here in downtown San Antonio in front of the Alamo, as you can see. Most tourists and people recognize a picture of the Alamo when they see one. What many people do not realize is that they are seeing only the front of the chapel of the original mission. The original mission, San Antonio de Valero, was built by the Franciscans in the early 1700s, and it covered 3 acres of ground, so it was quite extensive around the chapel here. The story of the protection of the Alamo as a public history site is a long one, and many sequences of events have contributed to its historic preservation. To my left, this part of the Alamo next to the chapel was the only part that didn't have a wall. And prior to the battle, the defenders built a wooden fencing or palisades. And it's important because it was right here that Davy Crockett and his Tennesseans manned that stockade wall. This is one of the cannons or replicas of the cannons used by the Alamo defenders. The actual cannon was found in the wreckage of the north wall over there long after the battle. It was made of cast iron. The blue part, of course, was made of wood, and it was fully restored. As you can see, it's a large artillery piece that would require a crew of men to turn and place and fire and load. And it's a perfect example of public history being restored. I'm standing here in front of 2 of the 4-pound cannons that were found in the Alamo after the battle. These particular cannons were not used during the battle because they had no carriages with which to transport them. Today they actually sit in the approximate location in which they were found after the battle, according to the records of the Mexican Army. After the battle in 1836, of course, the Alamo lay in ruins. It was actually pretty much in ruins before the battle, and it was restored and the walls shored up by the defenders of the Alamo. The Franciscans who built the Alamo had abandoned it years before after their efforts to convert Native Americans to Christianity was not successful in the long run. I'm standing on this wall here. It's called the Long Barracks. It was actually 2-story at the time when they originally built it. The upper parts were rooms for the Franciscans and for Indians and their families who lived in the Alamo. And the lower part were different carpentry shops, pottery shops, blacksmith shops, and so forth. This is a series of pictures of a plaque outside the mission showing the original walls of the mission and how large it was. You had a west wall far behind the Alamo Chapel. You had the north wall that, as I said, was underneath the post office. And you have a west wall that is currently underneath a whole city block. And then you had that short stretch of palisades that were built to the right side of the chapel. So you had an entire 3 acres of land. And inside, of course, was the long barracks, stables for horses. And prior to the battle, the defenders had built up positions so they could roll artillery to the top of the walls to fire at the enemy. There were no portholes in the walls, so they had to fire from the top, and they had to build ramps out of the earth to roll or push up the cannons. The church is far back, and of course inside the compound. This plaque gives you an idea of just how large the original Alamo was. The distant building you see behind me is the downtown post office. It was once the federal building. It was built over portions of the north wall. The actual foundations of the north wall are underneath the building and not accessible to any archaeological excavations. But the distance from the chapel to the wall here, it gives you an idea of the largeness of the compound. I'm standing in front of the Cenotaph Monument, which was dedicated in 1940 to honor the Alamo defenders. In the late 1840s, the Alamo became a quartermaster depot supplying federal troops during the Mexican War and the Indian Wars. And it was during this time that the frontage of the chapel was changed to resemble the Alamo the public has come to know. In repairing the roof, the U.S. Army capped the facade with its distinguishing parapet, the rounded top in the center. And as the Indian Wars ebbed, the Army eventually left and commercial development began. Right adjacent to the Alamo here, for example, there was a multi-story wholesale grocery warehouse and other businesses around the Alamo grounds. Inside the Alamo, there is a museum with a huge collection of memorabilia as well. Across the street from the Alamo, behind me, behind Alamo Plaza, there is an archaeological finding that shows a remnant of the western wall. It's blocked off right now by construction, so I can't get to it, but that was the extent of the western wall, which is far from the original chapel that we see today. And buildings are built there that were built in the 1890s into 1920 era. So the actual wall is under those buildings. There has been several archaeological digs over the years locating where the original wall stood. And these excavations uncovered numerous artifacts, such as parts of swords, parts of rifles and pistols, cannonballs, bullets, pottery, even a human cranium. The skull was determined to be that of a male aged 17 to 25, and there were 2 long indentations in the cranium, believed to be the result of a Mexican officer's saber. I want to include in this presentation some of the public history of the Alamo. In 1885, the state of Texas purchased the Alamo from the Catholic Church and granted custodialship of the Alamo to the city of San Antonio. In 1893, a San Antonio women's group led by Adina de Zavala, affiliated with the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, made preservation of the Alamo one of her life's goals. In 1903, Clara Driscoll, a wealthy local woman and one of the founders of the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, purchased the commercial property adjacent to the Alamo and restored the long barracks that we talked about. In 1905, the grounds were ceded to the custody of the Daughters of the Republic of Texas to be maintained as a memorial to the defenders. In 1908, fear of commercial development obliterating the Alamo property, Adina de Zavala, who was the granddaughter of the first vice president of the Republic of Texas, barricaded herself in the Alamo, drawing national attention to the site. She did this in response to a plan to remove the Alamo and make it a city park. She desired the mission period of the Alamo to be emphasized and proposed a reconstruction of the long barracks that we've seen, and her friend Clara Driscoll financially supported the plan. The plan for the park was dropped and the Alamo was saved. Later on, during the economic depression of the 1930s, Miss Driscoll purchased more land around the Alamo. The Alamo Museum was opened in 1938, the cenotaph in 1940 that we had mentioned already. More recently, the Alamo was taken from the Daughters of the Republic of Texas and acquired by the state again. This was because of new collections of historic memorabilia were required more professional management, and the state hired a company experienced with managing historic sites. In 2015, the Alamo, along with other Spanish missions in San Antonio, were recognized as a World Heritage Site. So we see the story of the Alamo is a story of public history preservation. Local women, in this case, with a passion for preserving the historic sites, influenced politicians, used extremely unlawful behavior, and they also found the financial means to make it happen. Without their devotion to preserving public history, the Alamo would not be here today. One of the things that should be mentioned about the public history of the Alamo is the Phil Collins collection. Phil Collins, a legendary British rock star, was or has been fascinated with the Alamo since boyhood. He said as a 5-year boy growing up in the London suburb, he watched the Walt Disney production of Davy Crockett, and he became quite enamored of it. His grandmother even made him a coonskin cap out of an old fur coat. But anyway, as his life progressed, he began to collect. Since he was so successful financially in the music business, he began to collect Alamo memorabilia and some quite significant artifacts, swords, rifles, pistols, things that belonged to David Crockett, Jim Bowie, Santa Anna, and they're part of the. He had a huge collection of these artifacts, And just a few years ago, he donated his entire collection to the Alamo, and it's inside the Alamo grounds in the Alamo Museum, which has been expanded. And that's one of the reasons they have hired, the state of Texas has hired a private organization that's experienced in managing historic landmarks. And all of that collection is in the museum. They're on the grounds now. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it.